I'm joined today by local scouting legend in Houston with RCS Sports, Jim Hicks, and he's also the co-founder of my personal favorite sports talk radio show called The Chop Shop. And I really appreciate you joining me, Jimmy. And my first question is, do you have any personal experience dealing with either non-violent police harassment or non-lethal police brutality? And if so, please share a story or two if you don't mind.
Well, I like the part about the non-violent police, yeah, but absolutely. I mean, in my community, that's normal. It's a matter of when and what to do and how you going to react when it happens to you. Going back, it starts for most, like for me, during the teenage years. But then, at that time, you really did not, because you're pure and you really don't believe as a teenager that your vehicle that you're driving, understand it might have rims on it, or it might have extra different coat of paint on it, and that vehicle is saying, come here, look at me, pay attention. But as a teenager, you really don't believe that during those days that's going to result in you being systematically or consistently harassed. So often I would get stopped back in the teenage days with, I had a Cutlass Supreme with what they call wells and bowls. Those were rims on it. And that car though, but those cars were, people that had cars like that or had those type of rims, and they were, pretty much teenagers, you got stopped a lot. And the officers would basically, they were I guess we'd call it being nosy, but then after you get stopped by the same set of officers, that car's in the same neighborhood, in the same area, and that car's not involved in any crime or anything, then you realize later on that, man, that was, they were harassing. You don't realize it then. It's like, why you messing with me? Man, then in some cases you took it for some guys, they really took that as a battle, as a stripe on their sleeve. Like, because the police stopped you, that means they liked your car. Some people really felt like that because it happened so much. And that way some guys would also be looking in the car and, these are non-violent encounters, meaning that so going on through college, you think about it happens on the highway. If you're riding in another, the cars as you advance and get older, another type of vehicle, and the police would stop you and they come up with some stuff, your license plate light was dim, your tint was dark. Well, officer, it's 10 o'clock at night. How the hell you know how dark my tint is? I'm going 65 miles an hour in the 70 speed zone or whatnot. You don't think about it then, but you stop there. That person is stopping. But the difference is those are state troopers in those when you're on the highway going to and from college. They don't have time to sit and do all other stuff. Either they stopping you, if they suspecting something, they're getting right to the point, as opposed to that officer in your city or limits. So then as you get older, now getting older in the recent years, you've had so much experience. For those out there who've had, like me, I've had so much experience getting stopped by the police to that I'm already on I have so many antennas. So if a police stopped me, because I've been stopped so many times, I've been stopped by the police maybe in my life, I would say easy 40, 50 times. Easy, 40, 50 times. And those are just the stops by the white police. I probably got stopped by the police more times than any black guy that you know.
I want to be clear for the listeners. You're talking about you were not speeding. Your license plate was not out. You just got pulled over anyway.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that I also want to just make very clear for the listeners, because it's common, unfortunately, for white people to sort of say, well, don't sag your britches and they wouldn't ask for your ID. Or don't put loud rims on your ride and they wouldn't pull you over. And so I want to talk just a little bit about the First Amendment. We have a constitutional right to express ourselves any way we damn well please. And if that arises suspicion of a police officer, then that officer is breaking his oath to protect and uphold the Constitution of the United States by clearly and flagrantly violating your First Amendment rights. And I wanted to point that out, along with also pointing out that, again, you're talking about being pulled over. I've been pulled over a lot too, but I'm lead-footed, right? So I'm doing 92 in a 70, and I get pulled over. Well, that's not harassment. That's the police doing their job. They're supposed to pull me over if I'm driving like an asshole, right? So I just wanted to clarify that that you're referring to times where they just saw a black man in a nice car, or a black man on the highway, or a black man in a predominantly white neighborhood, or whatever the case may be, and pulled you over based on so-called suspicion, when in fact it was A, a constitutional violation, both the First and Fourth Amendments, and B, they weren't suspicious, they were racist. And I just wanted to point that out. And so my second question is, of your circle, and you have a very large circle of friendships, in your circle of closest friendships with black men, roughly what % of them have experienced either nonviolent, unconstitutional police harassment or non-lethal police brutality? Roughly, ballpark. I know you haven't formally surveyed them, but what's the approximate % in your opinion?
That was approximately 95%.
And that's similar with the feedback I'm getting from black people our age. Younger black people, the aggregate % seems to be, I'm talking about current college kids, the aggregate % seems to be about 70%. And it's worthwhile to note the progress. It's more worthwhile to point out that 70% is still appalling. So I'm somewhat pleased that it's not 100% or 95% anymore. And I'm also extremely disgusted that the % remains that high in 2020 in the United States of America. And so my last follow-up formal question is, if it's 95%, do you consider this problem to be isolated, as a lot of white people insist, or would you refer to this more as a pervasive problem that needs to be more often discussed and more properly addressed?
It's definitely not isolated. I mean, people know. I just think that most people don't like to be attacked and bullied, not necessarily bullied, and proven and publicly proven wrong. And when it comes to this type of situation about racial profiling, the numbers are there. Even in a city like Houston, you have about approximately 2.5 million people in the Houston area. Blacks make up 12% of the population. They'll be 36% of the arrest, of the racial profile, and the thing is, we as a culture, remember now, the process of filing a complaint, most of us, when it happens, it's kind of like the battered spouse syndrome. And it's something like you mentioned earlier in your examples. Well, hell, the same thing goes. Does that mean that if the spouse don't talk back to the other, then they wouldn't get beat. It wouldn't be domestic violence. That's their fault for talking up. So in this situation, the complaints, we really don't have faith in the system, the Internal Affairs Division, or even understand how to successfully file a police complaint when it comes to racial profiling. And that's important because it's like a lot of things that goes in, and what happened to us, Pete, we'll get home because we're so startled as a culture when after you've been profiled, you get to where you're going, and first thing we do is share the story with the persons that we get to as to, man, guess what the hell just happened to me? So that's our therapy session, telling it to the person, and we just talk about it. And we talk about it, might tell the next guy, but we never filed a complaint. So that means that's never in the jacket of the guy, of the officer who's suspected of conducting the racial profile in the first place. That's the thing. So, I mean, do you realize in 2018, only one racial profiling complaint was filed against the HPD? Only one by a black person. The whole year of 2018. I say that again, Pete. Only one racial profiling complaint. So that means if you're on the other side of the fence, you say, well, hell, if you're saying it's so bad, Pete, then why ain't nobody complaining about it? We ain't got but one complaint. We just don't do it. We have to become more proactive in following all the way through with the complaints. And that's very, very important. I mean, seriously, it really is important because otherwise we're crying in the wind. We're crying in the air. We're not doing anything about it. Same thing if something happened to you at a department store, something happened to your kids at school, what's the first thing? You're known now because people would send an email which would give documentation of their problem. If you go up to the school just talking about that, it's not filing a complaint. We have to become more adamant in filing the complaint in the complaint process. Well, and that's the thing, to help. That won't solve everything, but that would help eliminate the excuses that the resistance is coming back from.
Well, a couple of things. You brought up a lot of. One, you're the first person to mention that specific issue of the importance of filing complaints. Two, I did not know the data from 2018. And I just want to point out to our listeners that data is often skewed. If you look at sexual assaults, if you say, well, only this many were reported, well, there were, 100-fold that were not reported. And the reason is that victims of sexual assault will feel like, one, they feel humiliated. They don't want to relive the experience. Two, they expect no one will believe them. And three, they fear retribution. And retribution could come in a variety of forms, whether that's being socially ostracized or whether that is the person you inform on looking for direct retribution. And in previous conversations with other Black friends, I know that fear of retribution from the police, if you speak up, is part of this, along with the unfortunate normalization of it. Like you said, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when and how often. And so when trauma becomes normalized, it feels normal instead of traumatic. And so I think that, like we talked about before we formally started the interview, I've always felt that a lot of Black people have something akin to survivor's guilt. Where, okay, the cop pulled me over for no reason in a white neighborhood, but I'm not going to complain because George Floyd is too dead to complain. And Tamir Rice is too dead to complain. And John Crawford is too dead to complain. And Philando Castile is too dead to complain. And so I think that the trauma has been normalized in a very substantial way. And I wish I knew how to undo that, because I agree with you that it's easy for me to say, because the retribution from a police officer is a little different than a retribution from a teacher, because the police officers have guns and a 400-year history of a willingness to use them, particularly against black people. And so it's easy for me to say, but I do fundamentally agree with you that speaking up and filing a complaint about the nonviolent, unconstitutional, sort of semi-petty, relatively speaking, harassment. And then the other thing is, you mentioned the disparity in the arrest rate. White people love to point to that as evidence of innate or additional black criminality. And so there's an important stat that I want the listeners to hear. Roughly 12.5% of America is black. Black people account for about 39% of the prison population. And again, white people point to these disparities and say, well, you see, they commit more crimes. But I want white people to understand that 63% of the people who've been exonerated based on DNA evidence were black. 63%. So that's 50% higher than the overall prison rate. And it's over 500% higher than the population. And so I think that stat should hopefully open people's eyes that the systemic racism is producing the lopsided arrest results and the lopsided incarceration results. If the police do a sweep through Kashmir Gardens and arrest 10 teenage black kids for smoking weed, while not doing a sweep through Rice University and arresting 10 white kids who were smoking weed, well, did the white kids not commit a crime because they weren't arrested? And so I think it's really important to point that stuff out. And now I will quit with my long-winded spiel and turn it back over to you. What else is on your mind? The floor is yours, and we can talk about anything you'd like. The formal part of the interview has concluded, my friend. So, like I said, the floor is yours.
I mean, I want to just add some intel. So I always like to provide possible solutions, and also while informing people. And I mentioned about the complaint process, and a lot of people really don't know that. And in Houston, you do understand that complaints cannot be made over the telephone. They have to be made in person, or you have to send in a letter, email, whatnot. If you want to, you can go to any police station and file a complaint. Any. So it means if it happened in one area of town and you were afraid to go into that office, because you can actually go to another substation and file the complaint. After your complaint, and once you file it, they must reply to you, right? In you know, with the updates on, or to get more intel. They will contact you. They will respond to you. Now, the thing is, that doesn't mean that the officer is going to get exonerated because of the way that the system is set up. And you have, like, we're going through some stuff in Houston right now where with the union, the contract for the police union, the HPD, expires at the end of this calendar year. And one of the things that was really, really intriguing was there's a section in there, Pete, and I want to say it's Article 30 in the current contract, whereas, get this, the police review, like when they go to the review board, they have their own court within, or their own oversight committee. Put it like that. I think that's what the name of it is. Well, it's 12 people. 6 is appointed from the police, the HPD. 6 is appointed from the union. Follow me? Mm-hmm. Those are the 12. So the union is there to protect their members. So think about, so what's the odds? It would take, it's kind of like going in the House, in the Senate, when you have, it would take for somebody on the union side to actually say, oh, hell no, in order for, if these all on one side, 6 say guilty, these 6 say not guilty, you're going to have an exonerated officer. That's why a lot of people are pushing for police reform, because that means there's, in certain cities, you have a civilian review boards, civilian committee. The mayor of Houston just earlier this week, that was proposed by Councilwoman Letitia Plummer. They shot it down. However, now the mayor said, well, we don't want to rush into that just yet. Let's wait and see. Well, you're running out of time, because the wait and see, meaning that what are you going to wait to? You're going to wait until somebody else gets in this type of situation like George Floyd. You're going to wait until somebody else gets, just in the public eye, gets no build. And then, but this contract, that's very important. So it's one of the little things like that I mentioned to you guys can help raise your antenna and help and maybe influence more people to become more enthused about what's going on and how to help solve. Because some people just don't know how to solve. They feel like, well, man, what our council person, that's their job. We voted for this person. They're supposed to go and do this. Our civic club, there are different means. But back to one of the things that you mentioned a while ago, the racism and racial profiling. Understand something. If an officer stops, right, and detain you in a motor vehicle or individual based on your race, that's racial profiling. If they stop and detain you, right, and try to go and do a consenting search. I don't know what the law. I don't actually know what the laws are now, because I know it as far as consenting search. But those should be outlawed. Those should be banned. Should be probable cause. I mean, we are the most searched race on traffic stops. Blacks are the most searched race there is, as far as searching the vehicles during traffic stops. Understand, Pete, our people have seen videos over and over of people getting killed, people getting abused, and they know it. You know why they know it? Because think about it, if you're paying attention, they just take 2 police-oriented television shows who was very popular in their ratings off the air this week. National syndicated shows. One of them was Cops. There's no more cops. Why would they take cops off the air if they knew they didn't start to feeling guilty? They meaning somebody in power. Think about it. You start to change. Some people would change rules. Sooner or later, your conscience will catch up with you. Sooner or later, you may realize what's right. Or sooner or later, once white people start having the conversations with white people to calm them down and say, hey, man, come on. That's not right. You don't have to do that. It's not. Then some of those same white people may be able to be more equipped and feel more compelled to have the conversations with black people that are their friends and are their allies. There are neighbors, black and white, who know right now that they cannot have the conversation with each other right now, because they would never speak to each other again if they tried to engage in the conversation. So know what they do? Just don't even bring it up. Just don't even mention it. Okay. But at the same time,
You're right.
But at the same time, I encourage you, people, if you engage in the conversation, which it must be had, otherwise you're fooling yourself and you're going to go and hide behind the point and say, man, we've been friends for 20 years. Well, you hold it for 5 more years. We've been friends for 25 years. And then the next thing you know, and the person show that side, it comes out, and you're like, man, damn, I didn't know. Well, this is the time to have the conversation. That doesn't mean, now the thing is, I've known this, Pete. I want you to try to insert this into your thought process moving forward. If you're dialoguing with, if a black and a white is dialoguing about this conversation about racial profiling or about social injustices, police brutality against blacks and whatnot, here's what you can't do. In certain conversations, they have what they call triggers, right? Just like in life, you know, you have triggers. Certain things that you can say, meaning that if me and you debating, Pete, and we're talking, and all of a sudden I say your mama, well, that's a trigger. Especially if your mom is dead. So that's off limits. We can rank, we can talk, but I can't say your mama. That's how it was back in the old days. You would do jokes, but you couldn't talk about this. That's why certain things in public, you can talk about certain things, but people normally don't talk about people's kids. They normally don't talk about people's wives normally. Well, in this situation, if you're going to engage with the black-white conversation, which I encourage everybody to try to prepare themselves to do in the near future. On a positive note, black folk, you would be best advised not to never mention the word Donald Trump in the conversation. That would be a trigger for most whites. White folk, if you're going to have the conversation with black, I strongly encourage you to not mention the name Barack Obama in any form, shape, or fashion in the conversation. Those are two of the most vital triggers right now. Meaning if you say one, then you might as well just mute your phone because the other person is not hearing you. If you say Donald Trump and blame, and somehow during the course of social injustice, somehow it leads to that, and you say and you reference him, white folks ain't hearing us. So we have to find ways, because that's the easy way. You can't push nobody's button. The buttons are there. And some people are strong enough to remove those buttons, but you don't know. Don't pick. We can't use that. So can a conversation be held without one mentioning or triggering the other person who was an ally of yours? That's the question.
I think that's a very profound thought. The notion that if you intend to have a genuine and productive conversation about race relations and racial injustice, leaving politics out of it probably is best. If it's a conversation about racial justice, keep it a conversation about racial justice. I had not really thought about it in those terms before, but it makes a ton of sense to me. And I can tell you this, I did not know that, one, the fact that the union gets half the people on the board is a joke. That means that that's the same thing as letting Exxon police their own pollution. It's absolutely ridiculous. But the fact that the police chief picks the other 6 is the fact it's not a civilian review board. And I don't know if you saw what they did in Camden. And this is what they're doing in Minneapolis right now as well. And I hope it's what we do in Houston. And
they overhauled it.
What they're doing, because legally, because of the contract, and you're going to see union contracts talk about dissolution moving forward, saying you can't dissolve the police force. But because it's a new thing, it's not in the contracts. And so Camden dissolved the Camden Police Department. And then they turned it over to the county. The county established a new police department, and all of those officers had to interview to get their old job back. And the union couldn't do anything. And I would love to see that happen in Houston and really every major city. And I was also thinking that we should probably privatize policing and turn it over to an existing nonprofit like the ACLU. Because if you privatize policing, then the First Amendment issues go away. It's not against any laws, constitutionally or otherwise, for a company like Amy Cooper in New York, the dog walker in the Audubon part of the park, right? Who weaponized white privilege, and as far as I'm concerned, threatened to murder the black man who was trying to watch birds when she was the one who'd done something wrong. You look at if a police officer, she got fired because she worked for Franklin Templeton, right? And they said, you can't say racist shit and keep your job around here. But it's very difficult for a government entity to fire an employee for having an opinion, because that's a First Amendment issue. The government is not allowed to police your thoughts and your statements in the same way the private sector could. But if we dissolved HPD and privatized it under the watchful eye of the ACLU, and a cop made a racist Facebook post, which I've seen plenty of, the new private entity could fire that cop on the spot. And it's a lot more complicated, again, for a public entity to fire someone for expressing a racist opinion. So, well, I tell you what, I really appreciate your time. You've always been one of the outside the box thinkers I admire the most. And you just got my gears turning about, I'm wondering if maybe I can start a petition to force city council and the mayor to pay attention to, one, there should be an online method to file a complaint. You should not have to go in person. They're putting up a roadblock of even taking the first step toward police accountability. And then two, at a minimum, we need a civilian review board to process these complaints. The fact that it's 12 police officers, 6 handpicked by the union, they would ask any cop if they think that an accused person who's been arrested should be able to pick 6 jurors amongst his closest friends. And I'm sure they would tell you no. There's a fundamental, obvious unfairness there. So I just appreciate you so much. And again, it's rcssports.com, and it's the Chop Shop HTX on Facebook. And for anybody watching who does not check out the Chop Shop, I promise you wouldn't regret it if you did. It's the hands down the least. It's not boring, is what it is. Like so many talk radio shows are boring. Like they're so I think it's very hard to do prep work for an interview without the interview then being scripted and dull. And you guys do an incredible job of balancing that. You prepare for the interviews like the professionals you are, yet you're not stuffy in how you go about it. So anyway, I just appreciate you across the board, the great work you've done in Houston. You've been a good friend to me for a long time. And again, Jimmy Hicks, my friend, thank you so much.
I appreciate it. Thanks, Pete.